Hello, welcome everybody, good evening. Thank you very much for coming. Welcome to what I'm sorry to say is the last in the current series of London lectures on madness and mental health brought to you by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. It's a great pleasure to have with us our final speaker in the series, Camillia Kong, who is a strategic senior lecturer in the Department of Law at Queen Mary, University of London, and a fellow of the Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences. Camillia has been PI on at least 2 large research grants, Reproducing Borders and Bordering Reproduction, Access to Care for Women from Ethnic Minority and Migrant Groups, that's 1, and Judging Values and Participation in Mental Capacity Law, that's the other, both funded by the AHRC. And she's also a research associate at the Ethox Centre, University of Oxford, where prior to her appointment at QMUL, she held a British Academy postdoctoral research fellowship. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. Her talk is on disenchantment and the immanent frame in conceptualizing cognitive impairments. Camillia, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say thank you to Edward and the Royal Institute of Philosophy for the very kind invitation to come and speak and give you my own perspective about mental health, and particularly in the global context. So just to contextualize my talk, I want to start with 3 quotations. So the first is this: the role of spirits is prominent in the causation of illness, and though witchcraft is outlawed in most of sub-Saharan Africa, this category continues to be used in an important way of explaining misfortune. Finally, there is evidence that with the influence of colonialization and change, views about illness are also changed. And then we have this quotation: the religious magical model of disability gained root in traditional African societies as a result of an apparent lack of education and ignorance of the nature of disability, coupled with a blend of superstition and a belief in eugenics. Since the introduction of Christianity and of Western education, children with disabilities are no longer being killed in Ghana. And then finally, we have this one: the major difference between the dehumanizing discourse and the human rights disability discourse is the legal status afforded to people with disabilities. Although the human rights discourse, as a variant of the social model, is making progress in Africa, the disempowering, dehumanizing discourse is still deafening. So these quotations reflect powerful views about the nature of African thought and sociocultural practice. In the first, colonization is not problematized, but it is seen as part of the progressive development that has reduced spiritual causation of mental disorder. And in the second, the traditional African conceptual schemas surrounding mental disorder and disability are equated with ignorance and superstition. And in the third, these schemas represent a lack of progress that runs counter to the normative frame of human rights. Now, these evaluations are common, reflecting an implicit assumption that Western conceptual schemas represent an explanatory and normative advancement in relation to indigenous spiritual approaches that are commonplace in the global South. We might characterize these represented views as globalists, those who presume the normative validity of some kind of uniform standard of our criteria of global treatment and legal respect. The movement for global mental health, which is spearheaded by Vikram Patel, the author of the first quotation, has adopted this model of scaling up psychiatric treatments to reduce the treatment gap between the global South and the global North. Another global normative agenda has come in the form of rights-based protections, specifically the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Now, interestingly, though both global agendas have radically different endpoints, especially around the medicalization of disorder and the putative permissibility of involuntary treatment, they nonetheless share a common epistemological standpoint that disregards implicitly or explicitly, Indigenous conceptual schemas around illness, disability, and health. Now, globalist agendas of these kind have been subject to significant re-evaluation. So as critics have noted, this agenda of scaling up psychiatry in the global south effectively amounts to another kind of illegitimate colonial endeavor, whilst legal human rights frameworks suffer from this pragmatic unenforceability and a general ignorance of how alternative notions of personhood may be fundamentally incommensurable with the individual's framing of liberal rights. Typically, these criticisms have focused on the need to decolonize global health through a post-structuralist prism that presumes an equally incoherent stance of cultural relativism, in my view. Now, what I want to do today is provide an altogether different kind of intervention in this space. I am less interested in mounting a post-colonial critique of the globalist position. Rather, I want to interrogate the motivation behind the reductive evaluations of spiritual and extrahuman causation models, which reflect what I would say is a hermeneutic deficiency. So specifically, globalist comparisons between the global south and global north approaches towards mental disorder and cognitive disability often appeal to these crude distinctions where you have a biological approach versus a kind of spiritual approach to causation, or you have a normative perspective, which is a rights-based approach versus superstitious abuse of individuals. But pervasive in this discursive space is also the treatment of African conceptual schemas as coextensive with unenlightened superstition and spirituality, in contrast to this kind of epistemic sophistication of Western secular medicine, science, and human rights. But I want to ask, what motivates this view? How can we make philosophical sense of this reductive tendency in globalist positions, which tend to discount the spiritual or extrahuman domain from the causation and treatment models of disability and disorder? And what is the benefit of resisting these reductive tendencies, particularly in regards to better understanding divergent cultural approaches to mental health and cognitive disability? Now, I would argue that the answer to these questions demands a twofold move. First, we need to zoom out and then a gradual zooming in. Now, the move to zoom out is necessary to highlight a particular hermeneutic deficiency that motivates these evaluative dichotomies that I've just set out here. Interpretive shortcomings stem from a failure to understand the complex, value-laden process of disenchantment as a contemporary lived understanding in Western secularism. And a more nuanced frame of understanding this journey of Western secularism opens up the possibilities of zooming into alternative, non-secular modernities which have thick concepts surrounding personhood, disorder, and disability. And so we can highlight how indigenous spaces of hope, healing, and coping may not hinge on the presumed superiority of Western scientific or materialist treatment models or rights-based interventions. But this dual move of moving out and moving in means attuning our theoretical prism to the phenomenological texture of lived experience in all its complexities. And that's what I'm trying to do in this talk. So my paper, therefore, has the following aims. First, I want to provide a philosophical diagnosis of this hermeneutic deficiency that lies behind globalist views, which tend to inform Western approaches to mental disorder and disability, suggesting it's symptomatic of this flattened landscape that has naturalized a disenchanted view of secularism in Western modernity. And as shown in Charles Taylor's magisterial book, A Secular Age, this flattened landscape is effectively a closed immanent frame, and I'll go into detail what this means. But this closed immanent frame ultimately presumes spiritual closure is the only viable epistemic and moral option that is available to us. Second, I will suggest that interpretive openness towards the complexities of African cosmology, and within it, the role of disability and disorder, requires spinning the immanent frame open. And this will problematize some of these crude distinctions that are preeminent around the supernatural versus natural, that implicitly informs evaluative, reductive evaluations of African conceptual schemas. And then the third is that I want to draw attention to the complexity that exists within enchanted conceptual schemas through an exploration of the spirit child phenomenon in Ghana. And this case study helps draw out ways in which an open, immanent frame helps interpretively reframe indigenous pathways of hope and agency with which we would not discern otherwise. And just to clarify, in this talk, I'm not making a sharp distinction between mental disorder and cognitive impairment, because in both causation models, when we think about the biological model, and particularly in secular and then the enchanted models in non-secular modernities, these distinctions between mental disorder and cognitive impairment are not hard and fast. So let me start with what I mean by the flattened landscape. So my first claim is that pejorative evaluations of African conceptual schemas around mental disorder and cognitive impairment are intimately linked to a particular story about Western modernity, and one that has brought with it its own reductive prism that masks the complexity of this journey towards secularism. And to see this connection, I want to first clarify a set of relevant distinctions between enchantment and disenchantment as a contemporary lived understanding. So we have one very influential account of disenchantment, which is in Max Weber's notion of rationalization. And in Weber's account, the historical phenomena of modernity begins with the rise of the Puritan work ethic and monotheistic faith, and eventually its rejection through the fragmentation of values. However, as Charles Taylor has shown, this picture is an overly simplistic vision of modern secularism as a contemporary lived understanding and a condition of experience. So enchantment involves a notion of the world that is inhabited by extra-human agents, such as relics, ancestors, spirits, demons, moral forces, which are palpably felt and impinge on our lives. They can have malevolent or benevolent intentions or purposes, and the boundary between personal agency and impersonal force is more fluid. These powers or influences can exogenously induce, impose, or give effect to meaning in the human world, and our experience and in coming in contact with them, we fall within their field of influence. And as Taylor writes, I quote, "Charged things can impose meanings and bring out physical outcomes proportionate to their meaning," end quote. Now, by contrast, we have disenchantment, and where this is a world where extra-human agents is no longer a lived experience. Their existence is no longer experienced or felt, and the locus, as a result, moves inward, where interior human minds and introspective self-awareness is axiomatic of all experience or sense of purpose. So in this disenchanted world, belief in the spiritual realm is mediated through further explanation, or exists within a context of skepticism or doubt or argument. And particularly through this prism, our biological condition and minds mediate the meanings with which we imbue the world. Meaning as such is endogenous rather than emanating from something outside of us. And a different existential condition thereby accompanies this lived understanding of enchantment or disenchantment. So in an enchanted cosmos, we have a self that is porous, and I quote, "As a mode of experience, this is captured by the saying that we feel ourselves vulnerable or healable to benevolence or malevolence, which is more than human, which resides in the cosmos or even beyond it. This sense of vulnerability is one of the principal features which have gone with disenchantment. Now, by contrast, with disenchantment, we have the buffered self, and this dominates the disenchanted cosmos. And the mind with the buffered self, the mind is viewed as a boundary between the world and the self, and meanings are effectively self-generated. And this is accompanied by a kind of moral aspiration towards disengaging with the world, including our social world, such that this disengagement provides the optimal conditions for self-control and self-determination. Now, according to Taylor, this transition in our Western cultural milieu from enchantment to disenchantment as a predominant mode of experience has been explained through this immanent frame. And this immanent frame denotes different scientific, social, technological, ethical structures that are based on the natural or this worldly order perceived to be self-sufficient. So, i.e., that is, it's detached from any reference to the supernatural or transcendent. But, and to quote Taylor, he says this, but this order of itself leaves the issue open as to whether, for purposes of ultimate explanation or spiritual transformation or final sense-making, we might have to invoke something transcendent. It is only when the order is spun in a particular way that it seems to dictate a closed interpretation. So a closed reading of the immanent frame, according to Taylor, has characterized this predicament of Western secular modernity. And this closed reading holds as self-evident that the natural or the material order is all that there is. And in other words, disenchantment becomes conflated with and effectively naturalizes the end of faith, spirituality, or transcendence of any kind. Now, what we see with the immanent frame, the closed immanent frame, is a package of mutually reinforcing assumptions, which unite this materialist outlook with a moral vision of agency that lends itself to the conclusion that atheism or exclusive humanism is the only option left for us. And first we have the subtraction story, which is a typical account of this is the loss of some transcendent reality, that is the death of God. It is precipitated by an advancement, a reputative truth of the scientific worldview. We are shedding ourselves of religious baggage, and this leads to the discovery of the truth about the world and about the human good that was already there. But the second, we also have this science-driven understanding leads to a particular construal of moral agency, and where it becomes a mark of courage to relinquish our illusions or comforts that are found in one's faith, appeals to the spiritual or transcendent, and that one has to use one's disengaged reason and trust in oneself and one's reasoning as opposed to any authority. And the result is this value-laden notion of agency, and I quote, in which disengaged scientific inquiry is woven into a story of courageous adulthood to be attained through a renunciation of a more childish comforts of meaning and beatitude, end quote. So philosophically, this story of humanistic power and epistemic maturity translates into this kind of courageous ability to act in the face of nihilism, exhilarating in the kind of self-creation we see in Nietzsche. Now, through the prism of the closed immanent frame, what drives the evaluative judgment so strongly expressed in the globalist positions with which I began becomes a bit clearer. The normativity of the subtraction story and self-constructed rational agency is evident in the notion of shedding oneself, of childish superstition in favor of a materialist, or biogenetic, or social constructionist model of disorder or disability. And equally, we have normative aspirations that are articulated in the form of individual rights-based protections, which focus on humanistic interventions rather than spiritual engagement. Now, but this process of hiving off the spiritual quest as a valid source of malaise or healing in relation to mental health and disability has ambiguous results, particularly in relation to what we conceive of as its therapeutic restoration. Now, Taylor, he describes a drive for fullness and a connection that occupies multiple layers and multiple registers in our lives. So at the highest register, these spaces create a wholeness that breaks through our ordinary existence, such that one effectively transcends the self. And this could be through spiritual experiences or through a sense of awe in sublime nature. Yet most of us somehow occupy the middle register, where we affirm the goodness of everyday life, of our ordinary existence, our vocation, our children, our families, etc. But this hierarchy in our moral orientation helps describe how those living in the middle register might still feel an absence of fulfillment or wholeness, and long for something that is transcendent, even as the projects of everyday life stand fulfilled. So our ability to occupy this middle condition hinges on the ability to avoid prolonged sense of emptiness, but also where we have intermittent contact with the higher register of fullness. So what the immanent frame, according to Taylor, what the immanent frame does, it lowers the bar to this middle register. It normalizes the affirmation of everyday life and the recovery of the authentic innocence of human beings. Ailments and illnesses that were previously thought to be caused by spiritual deviation or misdirection, such as melancholy, emptiness, are now pathologies or sicknesses within the mind or body. And these result in forces that compromise the innate purity and goodness of human beings. So this results in the lowering of human aspiration, and this is what Taylor writes. We will expect a lot more people to attain to normalcy, somewhere in the middle range as far as moral perfection is concerned, having got rid of their unease or learned to live with it. The intersection of full capacity and humanity will be set at a lower altitude. But for spiritual outlooks of the transformation perspective, Christianity and Buddhism say, the point where we achieve our full human capacity beyond pathological and other confusions about our spiritual condition is placed well beyond the level of recognized human flourishing. It is a distinctly minority phenomenon. Now, in constraining the language of fulfillment to the middle register, to the ordinary, what this means is that through the closed immanent frame, aspirations towards or engagement with the transcendent are seen as inimical to healing or restoring balance. So as Taylor writes, a crucial feature of purely immanentist therapy is that the cure of these incapacities is held to involve or even demand our repudiation of, or at least distancing from, an aspiration to the transcendent like religious faith. So therapeutic responses to disorder and disability are effectively pharmaceutical, or they'll have behaviorist overtones, or a combination of both. An appeal to an enchanted reality for restoration, healing, and coping, in other words, runs contrary to the actual remedy. Indeed, might even be thought of as pathological. So within this philosophical story of Western secularism, we begin to see the power of the closed immanent frame lurking behind clinical and rights-based models of cognitive disability. So its package of mutually reinforcing assumptions bolster these materialist or social constructionist explanatory models, or the behavioristic assumptions and treatment models that involve sharp delineations between spiritual direction and therapeutic intervention. And it also explicitly clarifies the tendency to denigrate and infantilize enchanted conceptual schemas which treat spiritual transcendence as a legitimate mode of healing and transformation. So what I want to do is spin the frame open and see how this helps us understand African conceptual schemas. Now, Taylor's core agenda is to challenge a narrative modern secularism, which naturalizes this closed immanent frame. And he wants to spin the frame open. And once open, we can understand that Western secularism is a fundamentally value-laden construction, which provides a new mode of experience involving a novel constellation of identity and a novel constellation of our place within the cosmos and society, etc. But spinning the immanent frame open also helps diagnose and correct crucial hermeneutic deficiencies, which I started the paper with. So to be clear, Taylor is describing a particularly Western trajectory of disenchantment. This is not a uniform global story. But yet, the reductive subtraction story that so often underpins decontextualized evaluations of alternative traditions of thought and praxis loses its cogency once we recognize the residual strands within our own secular modernity that are indebted to transcendent aspirations. So interpretive openness comes with understanding Western secularism as a value-laden, historically situated condition, such that alternative, non-secular global modernities become conceptually viable, particularly ones where an enchanted lived understanding is constitutive of epistemic and moral possibilities. With the immanent frame spun open, we can begin this process of gradually zooming in to better understand the internal coherence of non-secular conceptual schemas, which conceive of the engagement with the spiritual, the transcendent, the extra-human as intrinsic to ethical striving and human flourishing. So I want to focus a little bit more on this kind of opening up the conceptual space in African thought and then explore some of the ethical possibilities through the case study of the spirit-child phenomena. Now, the package assumptions of the immanent frame makes little sense within African conceptual schemas, which combine a deeply empirical orientation to questions of existence and morality. And as an illustration, I want to consider the ontological commitment within the philosophy of the Akan people in Western Africa. Now, according to this framework, the world order is anthropocentric, but humans are placed within a hierarchy of beings, which includes a supreme being, ancestors, spirits, as well as those of animals, plants, and inanimate objects within its lower rungs. Quasi-Wiredu shows that within this conceptual framework, to exist in the Akan language is to be at some place, meaning that existence is quite literally spatial. Equally, these existences within the hierarchy of being possess tangible agency in the physical world, such that explanatory appeal to the agency of the ancestors, of spirits, makes coherent sense. So in light of this quasi-materialist ontology, several concepts in Western metaphysics make little sense. So transcendence, as in somehow beyond space, is unintelligible. Equally, the notion of the spiritual and supernatural as beyond the world is incoherent, given there is no existential threshold that is drawn between beings that are of and beyond nature. So assumed to be a basic feature of the immanent frame, Western metaphysical and epistemological divisions risk incoherence within the walls of traditional Akan thought. And as Wiredu writes this, accordingly, if an event in human affairs, for instance, does not appear explicable in human terms, there is no hesitation in invoking extra-human causality emanating from the higher or even the lower rungs of the hierarchy of beings. In doing this, there is no sense of crossing an ontological chasm, for the idea is that there is only one universe of many strata wherein God, the ancestors, humans, animals, plants, and all the rest of the furniture of the world have their being. So appeals to the extra-human as a cause of mental disorder and disability are therefore regarded as equally legitimate sources of explanation. And the explanatory models of disorder and disability clearly reflect the influence of this ontology. So much research has shown how witchcraft, spirit possession, ancestor punishment, etc., figure prominently in African frameworks of mental disorder. But the interplay between divergent enchanted models is especially acute when we look at children with neurodevelopmental disability compared with adults who have mental disorder. And for this reason, what I want to do is focus on the case study of the spirit child phenomena, where children born with cognitive impairment of some kind are conceived of as spirits rather than humans. A spirit child diagnosis illustrates the profound impact of a spiritualized explanatory schema on a child, on a family, in a village, and some of these implications can be deeply pernicious. At this juncture, we might have the kind of global evaluations that I started with about it being superstition, ignorant. We could see that these would start to creep in. However, my view is that this case study reveals the complexities inherent to a context of enchanted plurality, where the interplay between spiritualized lived understandings at a phenomenological level reveals indigenous strategies of coping and resistance, precisely through and not despite appeals to some kind of transcendent purpose. So the spirit child phenomena occurs amongst the Kasani Nankani people in the Upper East region of Ghana, where children who are developmentally delayed, disabled, or atypical are thought to be bush spirits that invade families, fundamentally endangering the household. Children who are suspect to be spirit children are born with certain conditions: hydrocephalus, secondary sex characteristics, physical disabilities, infants that who are born with teeth and facial hair. In one study, children born with features of cerebral palsy are identified as spirit children. The spirit child phenomenon ultimately functions as an explanatory model for illness, disability, and misfortune. And just to give you a sense about how this is understood, this is from a study by Aaron Denham, one of his participants states this: "The spirit child is like this example. My mother gave birth to a child. Just by looking at this child, nobody believed that it could survive. Then some strange things started happening in the house. All the fowls in the house disappeared. We went to the soothsayer and discovered that it was a spirit child, and it was eating all the fowls in the house." And then we have this example. When they give birth to a child on the first day, you know they bring the child outside to bathe. After bathing the child and taking it back in, they may notice something wrong with the child, or the mother or father might not sleep. Troubles or difficulties will be falling on the father that day. What will the father do? The father has to go to the diviner and ask why it is so. He will discover it's a stranger that has come into the house, the stranger being the child that was born. It's the child causing these problems. So that child is not for the family, it is for the bush. And so suspicions of a spirit child will be followed up with the head of the household consulting the divination of a soothsayer multiple times. The factors that culminate in a spirit child diagnosis are complex and multi-layered. The possibility of a spirit child rests on this porous notion of the self that I explained earlier. And it is a consequence of women breaking certain sociocultural taboos around sexual intercourse, eating, relieving oneself within the liminal spaces that demarcate the literal and symbolic division between the household and the bush. Structural material realities intersect with a cosmology where spirits exercise tangible agency that can disrupt the family unit, whose stability is preeminent for survival and moral order. And this region is typically poor, and it's lacking in the economic development that is characteristic of southern Ghana. And children are viewed within this context as vital contributors to household survival. Caring for a disabled child removes not just the labor of that future mature child, but also the mother who is the primary caretaker. For example, in a context that is characterized by scarcity, poverty, and precarity, where food is rationed within the household for survival, it is notable that spirit children are often attributed with having these voracious appetites. Now, given the interplay of ethnocultural, gendered, and material dimensions, one might be tempted to adopt a kind of structuralist interpretation of Althusserian lens of interpolation, where cultural notions and ideologies are somehow naturalized or internalized, unbeknownst to ourselves. But I want to propose a different interpretation, one that not only understands the coherence of this phenomenon within African traditions of thought, but also acknowledges a context of plural spiritual frameworks coexisting within an enchanted cultural milieu. Crucially, encounters between these frameworks reveal ways in which a gentle engagement with the spiritual itself represents a direct confrontation to the spirit-child diagnosis, thus reframing the ethical possibilities that might emerge. So to give this example, I want to consider an encounter in a group discussion in the Bolsa North District, which is the Upper East region of Ghana. And this was part of a project that I led, funded by the Wellcome Trust. And it was looking at linguistic idioms around cognitive impairment, and the topic of spirit children emerges in this discussion. So one participant describes this. In my uncle's house, there's a child there. When he was born, we all thought that it was a normal child, yet for a long time he could not walk, he could not do anything except to eat well. Because of that, they said he should be taken and killed because he is a spirit. I objected to this idea and told them that I knew of a child of this kind who was taken and killed, and the whole family ended up perishing. After I spoke to them about this, they did not kill the child. As we speak now, the child is able to stand and walk, but it took a long time for him to learn to walk. Although the challenges with him are that he still cannot talk, and the stool comes out by itself, he cannot control it. He picks things from the ground and eats them, but we continue to manage him like that. So because of my intervention, they were afraid to kill the boy. Now he is able to walk about, but just that he is not able to talk. And then we have this with an elder in the community responds. But looking at how the person is, he's not able to walk. He cannot do anything. What work can he do for you? It is one who can work that you can say he should not be killed. But if the child cannot do anything, why do you not have to kill him? And then another participant chimes in, and they state this. The way that child is, it is a gift of God. If God had given you good things, you would have happily received them. So, if God decides to give you a child who is unable to do anything, you have to accept it and receive him because it is God who has brought him. This child you want to kill can become very beneficial to you in future. So you have to accept the child and wait on him. Now, in this encounter, the intricacies and tensions within an enchanted cultural milieu comes to the forefront. The Nigerian philosopher Menkiti writes about the epistemic resourcefulness of the village. And we can see this kind of at play here, where those within the community are faced with this epistemic task of trying to explain something that is unusual, and they rise to it, drawing on the metaphysical resources that are available to them. And the interlocutors here all appeal to spiritual or extra-human explanations to diagnose the child with cognitive impairments, but very different normative imperatives follow. So on one hand, the elder articulates the structural pressures of having a disabled child who cannot contribute to the household. These material realities intersect with a normative vision of African personhood, which treats the community as prior to the individual. At one point later in the discussion, he uses deeply dehumanizing language, describing the child as a thing, a creature, and not a human being. And on the face of it, we might find this view offensive. However, the elder's view is coherent within traditional African thought, including that of the Nankani and Bolsa people, where human personhood is a continuum and represents a normative achievement. It's not a given. A child is not born with the status of personhood, but rather becomes a person once an individual has become inculcated within communally determined duties, responsibilities, and standards, and is fully integrated within community life. And as Minkiti describes, I quote, persons become persons only after a process of incorporation. Without incorporation into this or that community, individuals are considered to be mere danglers to whom the description person does not apply, end quote. Now, on the other hand, with this last quotation, we have the rejoinder of another participant who represents a different kind of responsiveness to the spirit child diagnosis. So Christian concepts of the sanctity of all human life, about intrinsic humanity, provide a complex challenge to the non-human ascription within traditional African frameworks. And according to Denham, this orientation of God-given humanity has become part of the cluster of protective factors that, quote, not only change beliefs about spirit children and offer treatments or alternatives, but also transform understandings of who is human and how the self within others develops, end quote. Now, in another published study, one mother of a child with intellectual disability describes the internal cultural tensions between Christian and traditional African enchanted conceptual schemas. And this is one participant in this study stated this: we are in Africa, and so sometimes I hear a lot of things concerning spirituality in terms of children with intellectual disability being children of the rivers or what. And also you hear people say that they're going to escort them. And then they leave them to their fate at riverbanks. But as I said, I am a strong believer in God, so I do not think that my child is a river child. The only thing I know is that God gave her to us, and he knows why he gave her to us. So, in other words, appeal to a different kind of spiritual explanation becomes an agentive response, even a source of resistance to the strictures and ethical burdens represented in the spirit child diagnosis. Responses like this mother deploy their own commitments to spiritual transcendence to challenge other spiritual connotations that exist within the enchanted cultural milieu, and reframe the pragmatic and moral possibilities surrounding the care of one's intellectually disabled child. So to return to Taylor, remaining at the middle register provides insufficient epistemic and moral resources. The aspiration has to be set higher, one that attributes purpose beyond the middle register, such that having a child with cognitive impairment becomes a calling for deeper expressions of faith and hope. Strategies for coping and meaning-making, therefore, come through seeking some transcendent purpose. So we miss this subtle dynamic between traditional African and Christian conceptual schemas if our interpretive prism rests on the closed, immanent frame of Western secularism. In this context, biomedical explanations or rights-based solutions aren't viewed as viable options that inspire indigenous hope or moral imagination. Rather, attending to the innate human aspiration towards spiritual wholeness and fulfillment is vital to the restoration of balance and reframing the ethical possibilities. So, just to conclude, Just to sum up, I have suggested that the closed immanent frame in Western secularism has contributed to a serious hermeneutic deficit that afflicts globalist agendas, leading to a kind of conceptual and interpretive closure to the lived understanding of disorder and disability within alternative, non-secular modernities. And once this immanent frame is spun open, we enrich our understanding of the spiritual as an explanatory prism of disorder and disability, as well as its prospective therapeutic mitigation. The complexities and contradictions that are inherent to plural enchanted schemas also comes to the forefront. And I think that this is crucial to avoid troubling pejorative evaluations within globalist discourses and provide space for indigenously formed ethical possibilities in relation to the treatment of individuals with cognitive impairments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So it seems like you've grouped the sort of three streams that you've grouped. There's like maybe the secular stream, there's the indigenous African stream, and there's a Christian African stream. And you're kind of wanting to say these spiritual approaches, there's a complexity there because we have different streams that can come to different kind of ethical conclusions, and we don't want to just reject spirituality because of that. But it actually seems like the grouping is more like secular and Christian versus indigenous African, because like I think a lot of the original ethical motivations in Western culture are rooted in Christianity, including the intrinsic value of a human life. And so what you're seeing is like two Christian-rooted ethical traditions versus an indigenous African tradition. Does that make sense? I'm not quite sure what question I'm asking here, but like, is that a different way of seeing it? Do you think there's some truth to that?
I think there is, to be honest, I think there is some truth to it, but I want to resist that framing slightly, because part of the reason is because the idea that somehow the African Christian tradition is somehow coextensive and is playing out in the same way that we understand our, the kind of trajectory of human rights, or that kind of prism. I don't think that they are necessarily parallel, because I think the journey for in relation to African Christianity is very complex. There's a very syncretic quality to spiritual faith within these different contexts where, for example, to give an example around mental disorder treatment, you will have somebody who is a follower who might be Roman Catholic, who will still also go to a traditional healer and still pray, and still also then potentially go to a psychiatrist. So you have this kind of intermingling of different approaches that are not seen as fundamentally incommensurable. So the point about there is a tension between African Christianity and the African traditional frameworks, but there is also, for many people, they don't think that it is incommensurable. There's a sense in which that they can see it as a spectrum in some ways.
All right, so thank you for your presentation. And I think my question is more like a request for clarification. So in the very beginning of your presentation, you mentioned the concept of hermeneutic deficiency. And I think this is my first time heard this concept, and I'm quite interested in it. So would you please further elaborate on this concept, and how is hermeneutic deficiency related to disenchantment or enchantment? All right, thank you.
I have to admit, when I sent in my slides, I thought that I needed another point to go and explain it. So it's absolutely a good question. So when I think about hermeneutic deficiency, when we think about the tradition of hermeneutics, there's a question about interpretation and how do we adopt. What is our stance when we are interpreting well as opposed to one where it invites a complete closed interpretation. So when I'm thinking about the tradition of hermeneutics, I think I'm probably committed to a kind of Gadamer tradition where there's his account of hermeneutics is one where we are constantly recognizing that we're situated within a tradition, a historical context that always frames our horizon, our horizon of understanding, right? But that's not the end point. We don't just sit with those prejudgments, our prejudices, our traditions. There's a sense in which growth and interpretive growth and enrichment always comes with challenging yourself, challenging your traditions, challenging your own prejudgments, etc. But that comes with encounters with conceptual schemas that are vastly different from yours. Right? And so hermeneutic growth in some ways is one that is contingent on openness to something that is alien to you. So where the hermeneutic deficiency ultimately is in the fact that there's a kind of closure, there's an interpretive closure that is embedded within the immanent frame, and particularly when it's spun closed, because it naturalizes this idea that, well, a scientific, materialist, or social constructionist conceptualization of our place in the world, or our minds, our bodies, etc., is the only explanation that is there. And that means then that the way that we interpret other traditions is fundamentally closed off. It means that we are not open to how the truth that might be found in these divergent traditions. Does that make sense? Yeah?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting, and interesting to hear the way you put that schema together. I was struggling with some of it, though, because I was thinking of the parallels between some of the examples you were given and what's happened in some of the Catholic homes, and certainly also children's homes in Britain, which have been, in some circumstances, run by Christian organisations. The idea of leaving a baby out by a riverside. We know that babies were left in a cold draft by a window in Ireland and in Britain, simply really because they were born to mothers out of wedlock, or they were poor. And I don't really see a lot of difference. I guess maybe there's some possible connection between Christianity having been kind of overlaid over spiritual traditions that were, here in the West as well. And maybe those have somehow continued as threads through. It's difficult, but I think there's more to it there. I just wondered if you cared to comment on that.
Yeah, I shouldn't be. One thing I don't want you to think that I'm saying is that somehow that the Christian tradition is somehow superior in any way, right? I'm not making any claims, substantive claims or evaluative claims on that. Yeah, but where I think that there is. What I'm trying to do is effectively draw out the complexities here, because I think that there have been abuses of whatever faith, whatever religious background, whatever explanation, as there have been abuses from a kind of biological model, when we think about the kind of experiments that have been run on people, which has been, justified for instrumental reasons, but seen coherent within a kind of scientific imperative.
You use the term abuse when you refer to Western behaviour, but when you're talking about in the African framework, you've used a sort of different kind of terminology and way of looking at it. That's really what I was thinking. I think there's, do you see what I mean?
So can you say a little bit more about what
Why is one termed as abuse and another is a sort of range of possibilities that we should be open to?
I see. That's the thing. I think that the journey that we have been on is our particular journey. And so it's not even making an evaluation about our journey. It's effectively what I am making an evaluation of is the presumption of that closed immanent frame, the assumption that has sort of naturalized a package of assumptions, right? And what I'm saying is that forecloses what is happening in other traditions and modernities. And so it's not about, I think that I think that's effectively as far as the claim that I'm making.
Hi, thank you very much for that, by the way. I just wanted to add to what you just said now, and it's really interesting because as I listened to you explain the somewhat of a difference between the Western world and the African, coming from an African ideology and understanding of self and my experience, the spiritual understanding of how I understood the world was more literal than it was spiritual from my understanding. So the things that I was told were things that I believed based on my inability to comprehend rather than it being an actual spiritual understanding of something. So I can see where when you said in the Western world, it might be perceived as though it is a behavior that's conscious, whereas in the where in the Western, where in the African realm, it would be a behavior that's unconscious. So for me, my understanding of autism and all the disabilities that I'd come across weren't explainable based on my inability to comprehend my understanding of my human experience, rather than it being. So I'm currently a teacher of children with autism. And so from my perception of autism, I found that they represented a part of our human experience or our self that we had yet to understand. So the children that I find who do have disabilities, the people where in Africa that have, in my understanding, based on their how they've survived and their traumatic experiences, didn't have the capacity to comprehend a difference. They understood everything to be one, the way that they were told to do it. So I can go on. Sorry, I can go on about this forever, but yeah. So I can understand how one may be perceived as being more intentional, while the other might be perceived to be more spiritual. When in truth, it probably is an understanding of just a collective misunderstanding of how we see things together. So my question would be, how advanced the research that you've shown and the things that you've explained to us in terms of the enchantment and the disenchantment, are you trying to explain the physical understanding of self and the emotional understanding of self? Is that what the enchantment and the disenchantment is?
I think that the disenchantment versus enchantment is more so about how we understand how we understand our place in the world effectively, right? So when we think about the distinction between a kind of enchanted cosmos, it's the idea that there are extra human forces that actually influence, and it can influence our lives and have causality in our lives, right? And where in a disenchanted cosmos, that is one where that is no longer seen as a viable explanation, right? But what follows from the distinction between disenchantment and enchantment is that you have a very different notion of the self and how the self is situated in the world. Because suddenly the self, if you are suddenly there is no causality outside of you that can impinge on your life, then focus is on what can I do? You have a material or biological explanation that mediates your experiences to the world. Your experiences are always mediated through the mind. And whereas with an enchanted cosmos, it's not necessarily that inward move. That, there's not necessarily a sense in which that to understand an explanation, I need to mediate it through my mind or my interior experience. It's a sense in which there are explanations that are available to me because there are live beings outside of me that can really influence what is real in my world. Did that help explain?
Yeah,
yes.
it sounds similar to how Carl Jung explained the anima and the animus. So the physical people who are very much so more in their physical, and people who are very much so more in their emotional. So could that also be a similar explanation of the people who see things outside of the norm and those who just see things literally?
It's a bit like, for example, witchcraft being a very common, plausible explanation for mental disorder. Why someone is seen to be mentally disordered in different African contexts is seen to be caused by witchcraft or some that has tangible force that could impact the course of one's life and one's experiences. And the difference with a kind of a disenchanted model is one where that you don't, the appeals to witchcraft are pathologized. Right? It's suddenly like to actually think that something is causing you, something happening in you or your family that is outside of your field of influence, somehow that is pathological, or it's not, it's just seen to be a wrong explanation. Does that, so it's not necessarily about, it's not necessarily mapping onto the kind of physical or emotional facets of human beings, because when I think about the Akan conception of the person, of personhood, is really complex about how different parts of one's being comes from one's mother's side, one's father's side, but they are imbued with really thick meaning. So and it's not divided on a kind of mind-body division that is so preeminent in Western secularism.
Well, let me have a go. I want to sort of dig around in the middle of the paper a bit. So I think you said something like it's part of the secularist package to prize being normal, to prize ordinary human experience, because this idea of seeking your fulfillment in contact with the divine or something, that's gone off the menu. And so instead of this idea that only a few people are going to clear the bar for leading a really full life, actually it lowers the bar and lots of people will be able to. And that kind of prizing of the normal, or valuing the normal, valuing the ordinary, is linked to a certain picture of therapy, a certain picture of sort of correcting people so that they can all be normal. Okay, so I kind of get that. What I was surprised to hear you say was that this attitude to the normal and this attitude, this sort of associated desire to enforce the normal, or at least foster the normal through therapy, explains two features of the modern attitude to mental illness at the same time. It both explains a sort of biomedical attitude to it. I should have said it explains two features of mental illness and cognitive impairment at the same time. On the one hand, it explains a biomedical approach, and on the other, it explains the social model, the disability model. And I'd have thought that, forgetting about the spiritual, just from within the narrow perspective of modernity, of our contemporary view of these things, the social model is precisely a reply to or a rejection of that idea that everybody's got to be normal. It's saying, well, no, your normal is the wrong normal. You're just making me appear to be abnormal by, building stairs outside public buildings rather than ramps or whatever. So I was puzzled to see the biomedical and the social model lumped together. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, partly because of space. I couldn't really.
Okay.
But it is very, because I think that is absolutely a fair point. They are diametrically opposed in many ways. But what I suppose what I think is quite a common point is about how it still stays within the kind of human aspiration, that the focus is not ever going to be on some kind of transcendent explanation or amelioration, and somehow that kind of framework or even aspiration is never on the menu, as you say. And I think that actually is a really interesting commonality, despite the purported distinctions that are so often mentioned, because you have the biomedical model, which distinctly locates, for those of you who don't understand the distinction between the social model and the medical model around disability, the medical model is one where it locates illness and disorder fundamentally in the individual, that there's something dysfunctional, but the social models where disability is fundamentally created by social barriers and obstructions and so forth. So it's the social structures that are somehow are fundamentally disabling. And so I think the therapeutic, when Taylor's making that point about immanentist therapy, I think it definitely applies to the context of mental disorder and medicalized and behavioralist approaches to mental disorder. But where I think that he has some application, and so it doesn't apply necessarily to the social model, I would absolutely agree with that. But what I think it does explain in some ways is it does have a turn to human interventions being the source of how we respond to and challenge disability. And so the focus on human rights is very much a focus on this worldly intervention of what we can do as as humans, in our society, etc. And so there is a very similar move, even as they start with very, very, very divergent starting points about disability and the source of disability.
Hi, I was just wondering that with a spiritual framework, in a lot of spiritual models, even in Christianity, with being made in the image of God or Platonic forms, there is still an idea of a model or a normal that should not be strived towards, but it does exist. And in the examples given of God having provided a child, and almost ineffably we don't understand why, there's still an inherent acceptance that what has been provided is not like everything else. It's not, and I'm paraphrasing heavily, normal in the same way. Would it be possible to, as suggested, move away from the idea of normality and recognizing individuals as not normal with the spiritual framework? And if so, how would that fit together?
Well, I think in the African context, it's a little bit more difficult because, and this is where I think that the overlap between African traditional thought and African Christianity, there's a real intersection and overlapping of norms around the preeminence of the community, the focus on, even as there is a shift in terms of the intrinsic humanity of all beings with this Christian perspective, there's still nonetheless a very strong sense of responsibility to one's social community, to one's household, to one's family. And these social norms are deeply embedded in what it means to actually achieve moral personhood. And so I think that the idea of that kind of acceptance of individuals and when we think about neurodiversity and the whole move towards neurodiversity, I think that comes with certain presuppositions about individuals and as being kind of individual atoms in a certain way that does not resonate powerfully within the normative framework of certain African conceptual schemas. And this is a kind of blessing and a curse if you think about it, because one of the common criticisms of a kind of Western liberal rights framework has always been one that is too individualistic, it's too atomistic, doesn't take seriously the relationality of human beings. On the other hand, just to be very crude about it, you have African conceptual schemas where the community and the social is very, very pronounced and deeply embedded in a notion of what it means to be human. And there are, when we think about what is the kind of pitfalls of this reification of autonomy in Western society, we can see that, well, there are some wonderful things that we can see as exemplars in African community and the idea about the ideal of African communitarianism. However, it also comes with certain pernicious dimensions, just as we see with this kind of individual atomistic model that we see, that pervades in Western secularism. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi. Thank you. I guess for me, it's very interesting as a diverse person myself. I think my mind is more geared towards challenging the ideas of what is considered to say the influence of Christianity, um, especially considering when I think about how the ideology of Christianity was spread throughout these places, not just Africa, obviously Asia, other places. So I think for me, the spirituality and the religious aspect are two very different things, and I don't view them the same. I think for me, I find the language that we use, like normal, for example, when discussing the human condition is problematic. I want to understand more whether you feel like the work that you've done is more centered around the religious idea or the spiritual one, because as I said, for me personally, they're two very different things, and I do find what you're saying very interesting, but I'm not sure that I understand that what aspect of it is more from your, focal point, whether it's religious or spiritual, because I think for a lot of people they think they're the same thing, but for someone like myself, I see clear distinctions between the two.
Yes. Okay. So, I mean, I can. Kwasi Wiredu also mentions this. He talks a lot about the religion and Christianity and its influence in African practice and thought, and he mentions that he thinks that, well, if there's a kind of reflection that comes with adopting Christian faith, that we can say that this is sort of not a kind of unreflective colonial influence. And I mean, in the context of my work, I don't think that is necessarily that much hinges on it. And the reason being is because my focus is really on about how this closed immanent frame doesn't just foreclose, it forecloses all different explanations, not just so even if I took your point that the spiritual and religious can be sharply demarcated, the immanent frame, the closed immanent frame, discounts both ultimately, right? And so the point about being is about how it's not to say that the religious or the spiritual is somehow one is better than the other or making any values judgments. It is to really focus on saying how this closed immanent frame that has naturalized a particular package of assumptions around modern secularism has treated religious models as well as spiritualized explanations as fundamentally pathological or unnatural or part of a childish orientation in terms of our knowing and being and our ethical possibilities.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess for me, it's more the idea around both of those differences in terms of, say, for example, Western perspective versus continental perspective or indigenous perspective. Both of those, excuse me, both of those things are a byproduct, in my opinion, of social conditioning. So if one set of social conditioning suggests that it's pathological versus another one that suggests it's something else, for me, these are social issues. That's why, for me, one specific area of people may believe it's spiritual versus people that believe it's not. Do you know what I mean? So that's why it wasn't. I wanted to know more about that aspect of it, because I think the way that we analyze things as societies, whichever society we belong to, especially if we're people that are, say, for example, like us here, a lot of us are not necessarily in certain environments. We're here in the West, but we may have family members or whatever that have different ideologies that can influence the way we think about things. I want to understand if it really is more kind of pathological or just, because science and religion, some say, don't go together, but I see them as coexisting together personally.
So I mean, I think that I suppose that what I understand you to be saying is, I guess your question is, well, to what extent can we say that certain beliefs or belief systems or explanatory frameworks are the result of some kind of social structure, right? And so the way that I would respond to that, and that's precisely the reason I brought up Althusser and interpolation, because from a kind of structuralist approach, one that is from the critical tradition, one would definitely appeal to social structures as being deterministic in terms of our agency in some ways, right? So when he's talking about interpolation, it's the idea that these certain cultural ideologies are we think that that they're our own, but they are inauthentically ours in some ways, because we've internalized them without us knowing, or we've naturalized them ourselves. I guess this comes back to one of the questions around the hermeneutics, and I think that's because I start from that point about the fact that we all come from certain traditions in some ways, and we're embedded with them necessarily so, because we all have to start from somewhere, right? But the difficulty, and I guess part of the challenge that I'm having, and the reason I'm resisting that structuralist interpretation, is because it ignores how people negotiate these things at an agential level. And that, so the woman who responds to the spirit child diagnosis and says, look, God gave this child to me for a reason. And we could also have a kind of structuralist, overdetermined interpretation of what she's saying. Well, that's just, she's just an instance of immature, childish faith yet again, And that's what the interpretation that the closed immanent frame wants to tell us. Well, look at that silly woman, right? But instead, because we spun it open, then it means that we can see that there are, even when we but there are deterministic dimensions in all of our agency and all our ideologies and all our beliefs, but we negotiate these to find pockets of lived experience that mean that we act in the world with intentionality and with purpose. And you can see that her appealing to her Christianity, whether you call it religion or spirituality, that is a sort of agential intervention for her.
Hi there. Sorry, big voice. Thank you for doing the spinning open thing again, because when you were telling the story about the person going to the diviner, I just saw it as somebody in the West going to see their doctor and getting an opinion from the doctor. So the diviner said, do this. And I was thinking, well, why didn't they get a second opinion from another diviner? And would that happen? But the way you framed it, as if they've gone to one person, this is their diagnosis, and that's the only diagnosis they're going to get. And the parent is going to say, okay, I'm going to do what the diviner said. But I think even without the influence of Christianity, a mother might say, actually, I disagree with this, and I want a second opinion.
That is absolutely the case. I mean, this is why it's so complex in the context of even when they're consulting the soothsayer, because they will go multiple times. The diagnosis will be very, it might not be determinative. The first time might be a little bit ambiguous. The second time might be the third. And within the household as well, the dialogue and deliberation about this is ongoing, where there is disagreement. Oftentimes there is disagreement. Sometimes what has been the precipitator of seeking the diviner as well is where there is a kind of rupture within the household. There is a kind of division between the mother and the father. And so there are kind of relational dynamics that are playing out at the same time, that does not make this a straightforward process. So I think for anybody who's really interested in this, you must read Erin Denham's book, which unfortunately, the title, I cannot even remember the title. But if you look up Erin Denham, and he has written a wonderful book about this, and it's very, very interesting about the complexities precisely in that regard about the diagnosis and the fact that there can be internal disagreement. And he gives an example of certain mothers or family members taking the child. And then you also have the real interesting dynamic of how NGOs, there's an NGO called AfriKids within the region that deals with and tries to help families with children with intellectual disabilities. And how that intervention also plays out really in nuanced, complex ways as well. So it's well worth a read, but yes, it's not straightforward.
Hi, Camillia. I really enjoyed the talk. When I was listening to the talk, it was getting me thinking about some stuff in the kind of analytic tradition of philosophy, which has been happening recently about trying to resolve disputes between competing conceptual frameworks and different concepts. And kind of in that vein, the debates kind of come up to a point where the resolution at the moment, it seems, is a choice when you're trying to decide between different conceptual frameworks. The way to go forward is to try and isolate what functions it is that you're trying to achieve or what domain goals you want to get to. So in the context of like this discussion about mental health, and say like you go to a Western kind of person to ask about a certain mental health problem, and they give you solution A, or give you explanation A, which gives you like a set of options. And then you go to a kind of global South person who gives a different solution, a different set of explanations, which give a different set of options. They're not logically inconsistent with the options given by the Western person, but they're just contrary options. In that case, presumably you'd want to say that there's no conflict because they're not logically inconsistent. But if it was the case that, let's say, a particular person was kind of trying to decide which person to follow their advice, and they just didn't have the time to be able to do both of them, and they want to know, well, which one do I do? Do I listen to this person or that person? Does anything you've said today kind of give us the resources to decide how to proceed in that kind of conflict? Or would you just say, well, in that case, it's just a hard choice, and whichever one you pick is, that's the one you've got to go for?
I think, honestly, it's very difficult to pin it down to one answer, because I think that, so to return to that example of the individual who might have a mental disorder in somewhere in Accra, right, in Ghana, and they consult a herbalist, and they are also a Roman Catholic, and they somehow synthesize both of these, in their treatment, and because the way that they understand the self is where the concept of health is completely holistic. It's not that you just focus on alleviating your symptoms. It's the idea that you have to restore some kind of cosmological balance as well as social balance, making certain repairs, ameliorating your ancestors, all different things that is not just only located with fixing something that is biological in oneself. But it does not mean that taking a pill may not be, it fits within this framework. So in that context, it's not necessarily incommensurable. But what you see in these cases where, especially because there's so much work around mental disorder in the Global South, and you'll see those who have been trained in Western psychiatry, they will adopt a very syncretic approach to people's appealing to the traditional medicine, to spiritual healers, and they know that you cannot discount those interventions if you are wanting to also have them on board for your more biological approach to the psychiatric disorder. So I think that people negotiate this all the time, and they don't see them necessarily as fundamentally incoherent within the this context. Whether if we think about it in the Western context, we're not talking about necessarily Western psychiatry, but I mean, there have been studies, for example, of where psychiatrists show a reluctance to talk about any spiritual causation and spirituality of those with mental disorder. And just that foreclosure is really interesting in and of itself, that reluctance. So it's a question about also how much in say we're talking about Western approaches or the approach of Western psychiatry, then how much are we actually self-censoring the options that are available to people and their explanations that are meaningful to them?
So it's more about just complicating the choice landscape when you're kind of looking at this and making the normative subtleties more apparent, as opposed to like making it a clear kind of pathway forward. Yeah.
Contrary to your analytic philosophy tendencies, I could say yes, that is definitely the case.
I've been struggling to form this question actually, but it's really related to this phrase, closed immanent frame, which you're using in the context of your paper. Because from where I'm looking at it, it's not that closed at all. There's massive questions which are opened up by Western science's own kind of methods, which I think expose the psychiatric proposal, if you like, as it has been formed over the last, well, not actually quite recently, to quite large questions, which show that it doesn't really have any legs to stand on. And the same science is evidencing that the trauma model, which I notice you haven't included, but I'm assuming you're aware of, is far more relevant. So it's just trying to kind of consolidate that in my mind with this idea of a closed immanent frame, and I don't think it's very closed at all. And I'm wondering what the implications are for the idea that the kind of afflictions, if you like, that Western psychiatry like imposes in its thinking on people with symptoms are seen to be inherent to the person. There's something wrong with them, when in fact the overlap between people who have explained trauma-related conditions overlaps massively with a lot of these psychiatric diagnoses, in the sense that you can see that there is this alternative explanation for a lot of that suffering, way up to, much more than 50%. So I'm just wondering if you can see, yourself any kind of cracks in your arguments when you actually look at Western psychiatry from that point of view, because a trauma, like the baby thing, the trauma, that's a very shared human experience rather than being specifically Western or African.
So I should say that I'm deeply sympathetic to those models that are trying to provide a more complex picture of disorder or the sources of disorder, or and the trauma model is a great one. I don't think that we're in disagreement there, but I think that when you read about the difficulty of having the trauma diagnosis in the DCM, yes, and yes, and so and the struggle just to even get that, the trajectory. When we read, is it Van der Kolk, who's and that to me is a real testament in and of itself, in some ways, about how powerful there is a whole this closed immanent frame, in my view, in psychiatry still is. So I'm not saying that there is no complexity, because I do think that there is increasing complexity. But keeping in mind, when I think about the clinical research that is predominating in this space, it is not about around ensuring that we have holistic models of care or treatment or longitudinal studies. What is the focus and where is all the money right now? It is on trying to get to the biogenetic, the psychiatric genomics behind certain disorders. And even when we think about this whole notion about a diagnostic spectrum, when we think about a genomic approach, they're saying, well, this is great. This genomic approach means that we can see the overlap and how we're all on the spectrum of autistic spectrum disorder, or we all have, we're all on this scale of potentially having a propensity to have, develop depression or something like that. But it's still a very reductive explanation that is still propelling a certain agenda, I think. So it's not to say that I think that all of the approaches and the psychological approaches particularly are, necessarily are within this closed immanent frame. But I do think that the psychiatry still is very much under sway to the closed immanent frame.
No, I think it's absolutely dominant, yes. But I think what I'm trying to say is that I would view Western psychiatry, the dominant framework, as just as much of a, almost, not spiritual, but just a belief system. And I don't think there's any more fundamental scientific basis to it than just a belief system. And that the science, their own science, actually supports the trauma model, which is a holistic view, is the whole story of the person and their lived experience rather than looking at symptoms and trying to fix them with drugs. I think it would be interesting to reconsider, I would like to reconsider your proposal in conjunction with that alternative view. But thank you very much. Thank you.
Good. Want to have the last word on that, or are you in agreement, sufficiently in agreement?
I think that I am broadly in agreement, but I don't think that I'm not really addressing this. When I think about how the dominant prism in which we're thinking about global mental health and interventions in global mental health, it is that there is an agenda around scaling up psychiatry. It's not about scaling up psychiatric, psychological, holistic models. It isn't. The trauma model, for example, would have great resonance with some moves to try to decolonize certain views around mental disorder, particularly when we're thinking about Indigenous people. So I don't think. I think that we're not actually at odds. I think we're in agreement. But when it comes to when we think about how powerful it is still as an intervention, as a focus, an agenda, is still very powerful. But it goes back to the point where it's not even just Western psychiatry. The rights-based model, I haven't gone into great detail about that, but the rights-based model also has real problems when we're thinking about alternative modernities.
Great. Thank you very much. Let's thank Camillia one more time. And thank you all very much for coming. Those of you who've come many times over, thanks all the more. And we will be back with another series of London lectures in October this year on the theme of remembering and forgetting.